Senator Thorp.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. In presenting this bill to us today, the government once again shows that it's single-mindedly intent on its own particular brand of redistribution of Australian wealth. But I suspect this particular redistribution would have Robin Hood turning in his grave. Sadly, this bunch of merry men seem intent on stealing from everyday Australians in order to line the pockets of the rich, powerful and well-connected. Robin Hood in reverse, if you like. This is a government that is so far from the government they said they would be, they're almost unrecognisable. This is a government that seems to be completely uninterested in addressing disadvantage and creating a more equal, inclusive Australian society. Not only are they doing nothing to address inequality, but they seem set on actively widening the gaps between the haves and the have-nots through legislation of the sort that we're dealing with today. In this legislation, the government brazenly robs from low-income earners, families and small businesses in order to line the pockets of multinationals and mining magnates. Not only that, but in doing so they're forcing a multi-billion-dollar revenue hit to our country's bottom line. Recently, those on the other side have started to go back to their tried-and-true mantra of the budget emergency they say is facing the country. They used this confection before the election to scare the Australian public into voting for them, and they continue to use it to justify harsh cuts to those who can least afford it. Despite this, they were quite happy to provide an unrequested $9 billion to the RBA, even though experts confirmed that our National Bank was suffering no problems of liquidity. And only a few weeks after gaining the keys to the ministerial wing, they even had the audacity to request a 66% increase to Australia's credit card bill while refusing to produce any information to back up their request. These are hardly the actions of a government concerned about cutting back spending across the board. And strangely enough, we now see that they're so unconcerned about the state of the books that they're willing to forego billions worth of revenue in order to give the likes of Gina Rinehart a belated Christmas present. The mining rent resource tax is based on the important tenet that Australia's mineral wealth belongs to Australians. It's based on the idea, while international investment is important, Australians deserve to be compensated for the removal of mineral wealth that cannot be renewed. Labor supports the need to spread the benefits of mining activity in Australia to all Australians, not just the rich and well-connected. That is why we will not support the repeal of the mining rent resource tax. Mr Acting Deputy President, we've heard a lot of spin about the tax, and not surprisingly, big miners have argued that the tax could send them to the wall. The government has used this to justify a threat to Australian jobs. The position is a little hard to justify when you consider that the mining industry employs only 2% of the Australian workforce, or 261,000 people, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. In contrast, manufacturing employs almost quadruple that number at just under 1 million jobs. If the government really cared about jobs, surely they wouldn't have turned their backs on our car industry. But even if mining were the largest employer in the country, would the mining tax still be a threat to jobs? The answer, Mr Acting Deputy President, simply is no. The truth is that the MRRT only affects those companies that are already making a significant amount of money on the back of Australia's mineral wealth. The reality is that the MRRT isn't even based on revenue, but rather profits. In fact, when the Henry Review called for submissions, the Mineral Council of Australia itself put forward a recommendation arguing in favour of a profits-based tax as the most efficient means of taxing resources. And this is an important point. This is a tax on super profits, not just revenue. In fact, companies aren't liable to pay the tax until their profits reach $75 million. I find it hard to believe that any company that's making $75 million in profit, and I'll reiterate that, that's not revenue but profit, I find it hard to believe that they shouldn't be contributing their share to our nation. A profit-based system is much fairer than a royalty system because it means that if the price of resources goes up, companies make more money and more money flows back to the Australian taxpayer. It's a no-brainer. In a royalties-based system, when the price goes up, there's no corresponding increase in wealth going back to the Australian people. So despite the hype, no business was ever going to go bankrupt through the MRRT, as it was only ever going to be levied upon businesses that were achieving lucrative super profits. So we have a government which is foregoing this vital revenue despite bleating excessively about budget emergencies to anyone who would listen, and threatening large-scale cuts to the areas of society that can least bear it. And as a result, if this legislation passes, we will see families, small businesses and working Australians take a big hit. Small businesses will bear the brunt by the removal of nearly $4 billion in tax concessions, which were recommended in the widely lauded Henry Review. The bill will repeal instant write-off for assets costing less than $6,500. It also repeals the loss carry-back measures, which allow companies to carry back losses up to $1 million threshold. This measure was brought in by the previous Labor government in recognition that businesses don't run to a 12-month cycle and that profits can fluctuate significantly from year to year. Under Labor, this would have increased to 2 years from this financial year, giving businesses an extra fund injection in order to further invest in their businesses. Is it any wonder that the Australian Industry Group denounced these moves in its submission to the government, saying that they will permanently increase compliance costs and cut investment returns at a time when businesses can least afford it? Small businesses will also lose the special motor vehicle reduction, which allowed them to claim up to $5,000 as an immediate deduction for vehicles costing $6,500 or more. Families will also suffer as a result of this bill, as it rips away the school kids bonus, which was put in place to help struggling families meet the cost of their children's education. In taking away the school kids bonus, the government has been indulging in some serious misrepresentations of the truth in saying that it was linked to the mining rent resource tax, and with the repeal of the bill it must too go. The idea that a government can't make its own spending decisions on anything is an absolute nonsense. Those opposite as the government of the day will always have a choice about when and how money is spent. To suggest otherwise is completely disingenuous. Not only this, but this flimsy justification is also based on a bald-faced lie. The school kids bonus was never linked to funding from the mining tax. In fact, it replaced the education bonus to make it fairer and simpler for families to access help with the cost of their children's education. And I know very well, Mr Acting Deputy President, from talking to Tasmanian families, how important the school kids bonus has been in helping alleviate unavoidable costs of education such as textbooks and uniforms. Many have also shared their concerns with me about how they're going to manage these costs if the government gets its way and repeals this vital support. This is a government of confused, inconsistent messages at best and brute hypocrisy at worst. In one breath, they tell us that all they care about is removing the cost of living burden from the typical Australian family, and in the next, they tell us exactly how they're going to rip out thousands of dollars from those who can least afford it. Not only is the government ripping away the school kids bonus, but they've then gone further by slugging Australia's lowest paid workers to pay for their mining tax abolition. By removing the low-income superannuation contribution, the government will reimpose a 15% tax on workers who earn less than $37,000 a year. If this bill passes, it will mean the lowest paid workers in our country will be up to $500 a year worse off. We in this place are lucky to have very generous compensation for the work we do, so perhaps those on the other side don't think $500 seems like very much money. Maybe they'd even budget this amount for a special night at a restaurant. But for those who earn less than $37,000, this could be the difference between driving an unsafe car or finding the money to have it serviced, or between being able to pay the winter heating bill and having to shiver through the cold months with nothing to take the edge off. To put this in perspective, this callous move will impact on 3.6 million Australian workers. In my home state, 90,000 hard-working Tasmanians will have to find an extra $500 in already stretched budgets just to pay for basics like food, electricity, rent and clothing. The bill will also rip away the income support bonus, which is designed to help those who survive on the lowest wage of anyone in this country with one-off payments. Also, some of the most profitable companies in the world, Mr Acting Deputy President, can get a reduction on their tax bill. In what world could this possibly be seen as fair? And the pain for workers doesn't stop there. This series of bills also stalls the important increase of superannuation from 9% to 12%, which represents a blow to the future retirement savings of millions of Australians. It was Labor that brought in this forward-thinking reform in recognition of the fact that 12% superannuation is recognised as the amount people need to put aside if they are to have enough money when retirement arrives. By turning its back on this plan, the government will not only reduce superannuation balances by thousands of dollars, but it will also increase the burden on future governments, which will be lumbered with higher pension and welfare supports costs when they're quite unnecessary. Another short-sighted inclusion in this package of bad legislation is the scrapping of legislation which allows companies to immediately deduct expenses incurred through geothermal exploration. Labor brought in this deduction in 2011, Mr Acting Deputy President, in recognition of the importance in investing in renewable sources of energy. While there's currently no commercial geothermal energy production in Australia, Geoscience Australia predicts that just 1% of shallow geothermal energy could supply Australia's energy needs for as much as 26,000 years. By removing this deduction, the government is essentially removing incentives for investment in renewable technologies, which ensures that we will remain dependent on dirty fossil fuels for longer than we might otherwise need to do. They're holding back on the necessary transition to a low-carbon economy, which will ultimately lead Australia to become uncompetitive as the rest of the world rushes to embrace low-cost, renewable energy sources. Although really this shouldn't come as a surprise, Mr Acting Deputy President, given this government is also trying to single-handedly dismantle the entire toolkit Australia has to deal with climate change in favour of the Direct Action Plan. I'm currently the chair of the Direct Action Plan Senate inquiry, and I can tell you, Mr Acting Deputy President, we haven't heard from one witness who supports direct action as a viable standalone solution to address climate change. We've been told it's little more than an expensive slush fund for polluters, and it will ultimately be completely ineffective at addressing climate change. Interestingly, the Direct Action Plan will also see millions of dollars flowing to wealthy companies while the rest of Australia pick up the tab. I'm sure it's not just me who sees parallels between direct action and the package of legislation we have in front of us today. Both will cause a massive billion-dollar hit to the budget, and both will provide multi-million-dollar benefits to big polluters and resource companies. And most importantly, both seem to be completely intent on acting against the national interest. We need to remember, unlike my colleague Senator Ryan, that resources are finite. Once they've been dug up and sold off, there will be no more. We also need to remember that they belong to the people of Australia, and it's only fair that the people of Australia get to share in the benefits of this mineral wealth. But it's clear that when the government won government in September, they weren't the only winners. It's clear that mining magnates also hit the jackpot on the back of the election result, and we're seeing the proof of it today in this package of bills. Ironically, one of the most spouted arguments from those on the other side about this tax was that it didn't raise enough revenue. So it seems strange that rather than making the tax more expansive in order to correct their perception of this failure, they're deciding to forego the revenue entirely. If you put this to any reasonable person, they would ask the obvious question, why? Why would a government that is so concerned...
Senator Thorp, resume your seat. I remind senators on my right that Senator Thorp has the right to be heard in silence. Senator Thorp.
Why would a government that is so concerned about flagging revenue make it one of their first orders of business to further slash incoming funds? Why would a government that cares about working families and businesses wantonly slash the very measures designed to give them a helping hand and make the cost pressures that little easier to bear? Donation records from the Australian Electoral Commission might provide us with a clue to solving this mystery. These records tell us that since 2007, when the mining rent resource tax was first proposed, the Coalition was the happy beneficiary of more than $3 million from the mining industry. This compares to $119,500 given to Labor and not a penny to my colleagues the Greens. We need to recognise that if nothing else, big businesses are pragmatic. In fact, they have a legal obligation to their shareholders to make effective spending decisions that are in the best interests of their shareholders. These are not the kind of organisations that will throw money around willy-nilly if there's to be no financial return gained. Could it be that the Coalition is returning this generous favour in the form of a belated Christmas tax cut? Could it be that this government is slashing benefits for millions of Australians in order to pay their dues to their mining masters? I can only speculate what their motivations might be, but the figures don't lie. But if this is the case, we can see these donations have indeed been a smart move for the mining magnates who, by spending a meagre $3 million, have netted themselves a $3.7 billion windfall. Nice return if you can get it. It seems the age of entitlement may be over for struggling business, disabled people or for those looking for work, but it's alive and well for big corporations and mining companies. Australia voted for a government that would act in the interests of all Australians, a government that would maintain spending in important areas of health, education and support for people with disabilities. And what we've got, Mr Acting Deputy President, is something very different. A government which seems to govern solely for the rich, the miners and the elite at the expense of millions of Australians who are doing it tough. This is not the government we were promised.